Everybody, everybody settle down. Thank you for joining us for this session. We've already had some very insightful commentaries on the IDP situation, and we'd like to now look at the situation on the ground. We have an esteemed panel of representatives offering perspectives on different aspects of the situation today across Ukraine on the ground. I'd like to begin by just introducing our panel. We have Honorable Maria Yovanovitch, Ambassador of the United States of America to Ukraine. Mr. Jock Mendoza-Wilson from System Capital Management. Dr. Yuri Temirov from Donetsk National University. Dr. Kateryna Smagliy from the Kennan Institute. And Ms. Tamila Tasheva from Crimea SOS. So I would like to invite our opening remarks from Ambassador Yovanovitch to present us with a perspective from the American diplomatic point of view. Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Do I need to talk?
Yes, please.
Can you hear me? Thank you very much, Peter. And I really want to thank the Atlantic Council for hosting this event, because I think this is an important topic that is very timely. So I really appreciate being here today. And I also wanted to note just at the top that as the Atlantic Council monograph makes clear, the resilience, activism, and devotion to Ukraine of IDPs are an inspiration to those of us who are investors and stakeholders in the new Ukraine, a prosperous and peaceful Ukraine. And I'd like to start with really the most obvious comment, which is that it's important to remember why we have IDPs in Ukraine today, and that is because of Russian aggression. Russia's aggression against Ukraine has driven more than 1 million people from their homes and trapped countless others in the conflict zone with no place to go. So I want to be clear that the best way to help Ukraine's displaced people is for Russia to end its occupation of Crimea and its aggression in eastern Ukraine. Second, I think we have to keep in mind that the conflict is a hot war and not a frozen conflict. People on both sides of the line of conflict are killed or injured daily, and I think those of us who are watching it, which is probably everybody in this room, are noticing a notable spike in violence over the past several weeks and a notable spike in fatalities, both civilian and military. And that is a tragedy. In this context, we believe the Ukrainian government has taken some steps to assist displaced people, but we also agree with the report's conclusion that it is in the government's interest to do much more. The Ukrainian people themselves have shown a lot of compassion by opening their communities to their fellow citizens displaced by the conflict. They've formed local initiatives to address their immediate needs and to help them become fully integrated members of the community. It's really nothing short of remarkable, and I have a feeling others are probably going to address this part of it in more detail. But I've been amazed going to the city of Mariupol, which has been really visionary in terms of seeing how displaced people can be a resource rather than a burden to the community. It's made itself a home for universities and other institutions from Donetsk city. And I think that has shown a lot of foresight, allowing the city to develop human capital, modernizing its economy, and spurring economic growth. Also, as the report notes, civil society has really stepped up in important ways. But I think we would also all note that there's a limit to what civil society can do. And I think this is where the government comes in. Because IDPs have told us, and I'm sure they've told you, and numerous reports bear this out as well, that their biggest concerns are accessing pensions and social payments, as well as, of course, the condition of loved ones that have been left behind in the Russian-controlled territories of Donetsk. The Ukrainian government is, I think, uniquely positioned to resolve the issues of IDP access to pensions and social payments and the ease with which they can cross the line of contact to access them. And when I say ease, I mean, I use that term, but we all know it's not easy. And I think of the bridge at Luhansk. I mean, we've all seen that picture of elderly people, children in tow, pushing their produce on little makeshift carriages up and down that terrible bridge. This is not easy, and I think that it's necessary to do something about this. Many IDPs are also forced to use the court system to get their social payments and pensions. This is completely unfair. These people are citizens of Ukraine. They are entitled to their payments, and it's really a waste of government time and resources to force them through a court system, which really, frankly, is not necessary. So from our point of view, solving the issue of social payments would not only alleviate the suffering of a population that is disproportionately elderly, but would underscore that the Donbass and its inhabitants are a part of Ukraine. It would demonstrate that the Ukrainian model of governance is responsive to the needs of its people wherever they are, on whatever side of the line or in other places, which frankly would be a stark contrast to the model of governance that Moscow offers. So beyond the humanitarian aspect, beyond the fact that this is the right thing to do, the government should redouble its efforts to help IDPs for the sake of the peace process, eventual reintegration of the Donbass into Ukraine proper, and national unity. Specifically, we believe the government should streamline the pension process and immediately resume payments to all eligible Ukrainians. This includes displaced persons and people living in their own homes in non-government controlled areas. This is not assistance. It's an entitlement that citizens have earned through decades of their own work. They've paid into the system. They should be able to reap the benefits. Second, the government should reduce the bureaucratic burdens on displaced people who are trying to access social payments so they don't have to resort to the court system. Requiring IDP registration, something not required of any other Ukrainians, in order to receive pensions is discriminatory and contrary to the Western values that I think Ukraine is striving for. Third, the government should make serious efforts to provide housing for the hundreds of thousands of displaced persons who don't want to return to their homes after hostilities end. And on this note, we've heard reports from the UN and NGO partners that a growing number of displaced people are returning to occupied territory simply because they cannot pay the rent in their new locations. Many of these people are elderly, have exhausted their own financial resources after nearly 4 years of conflict. They should not be forced to return to the control of abusive Russian-backed militants because they cannot afford to stay in government-controlled Ukraine. Fourth, the government should also provide the Ministry of Temporarily Occupied Territories with the budget and the political support that it needs to fulfill its mandate, and they should adopt the IDP strategy proposed by the Ministry of Temporarily Occupied Territories. The U.S. is committed to doing its part and has provided more than $150 million in humanitarian support since 2014. Our assistance provides immediate humanitarian needs such as food, shelter, medical support, counters gender-based violence, and provides psychological counseling for affected people. Moving beyond immediate needs, we are also helping to integrate displaced people by supporting programs that build more positive relations with their new host communities. And to assist in long-term social and economic recovery, we're also supporting programs that help displaced people establish small businesses and gain employable skills to contribute economically to their new communities and increase their self-sufficiency. In September, I was in Kharkiv, and I met with a group of men and women that have been beneficiaries of a program of training as well as grants to establish their small businesses. And so whether there was one woman there who had established a glass factory to make glass and windows and things like that. There was another woman who had established a bakery to bake these very, very fancy and very, very delicious cookies. And these were people who had been forced out of their homes, who had picked themselves up, gotten a little bit of a helping hand, but it was really their own resilience. that had enabled them to start their own business. And not only were they supporting themselves and their families, they were providing employment. Maybe, in the bakery it was just for 2 other people, but they were providing employment to other people who had been afflicted by the conflict, whether they were veterans of the war, whether they were other IDPs or in some other category. These are people who were a net plus, a real resource for Kharkiv and for Ukraine. And it was, frankly, nothing short of inspirational to talk to them. So, in conclusion, I'm sure you're glad I'm saying that. In conclusion, I would just note that I think it's important for the government of Ukraine to do more to help the displaced and the conflict afflicted in the spirit of the Maidan. And it's important for the international community to maintain its support. I think we all know that 4 years into this conflict, the number of the vulnerable is rising. It doesn't take the UN to tell us that. We know it from the people we talk to, from what we see in our own experience. And what we also know is that today's vulnerables are tomorrow's employers. They are the future of Ukraine, and they deserve our assistance. So on that note, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now, our next speaker is Jock Mendoza-Wilson from the System Capital Management. Now, Jock, your organization has been involved in the support, provision of humanitarian aid and support since the very first days of the conflict. It would be really interesting to get some insight from your side of what do the communities you're working with want most of all? Obviously, the immediate aid issues in terms of the material support, food, shelter, etc., are clear. But what is it that they would like to see from yourselves and also from the wider international community?
Well, thanks for the question and framing my comments, which I'll try and keep to the 5 minutes. And thanks.
No pressure.
Thanks for the Atlantic Council for the invitation. Firstly, I'm here really to speak on behalf of the Rinat Akhmetov Foundation, and you're right, we were a very early responder. We were an early responder because organically we were there. We were in Donetsk. Our employees, their families, ourselves, including myself, were there when this conflict started. So we understood immediately that with the calls from the community of what citizens needed. And so we responded quickly, initially by helping evacuate over 50,000 citizens. And then quickly by providing them with the things they could no longer get, which at the time was food and regular, reliable food aid and medical assistance, where they needed medical assistance, which regrettably was frequently. So we've been a major provider of humanitarian aid into the east of Ukraine on both sides of the contact line since the conflict began. And I've been involved in that process. I think that crucially, for IDPs, they took a huge risk in their lives through extremis. They picked up everything they held precious and they left. And most of them chose to move to Ukraine, to government-held Ukraine. And leaving behind their homes, their families, they left behind, in some cases, their elderly parents or other members of family who didn't want to move. And so many of them remain, although here, in this side of the contact line, are deeply connected to the communities on the other side of the contact line. I'll come on to that later as to why that's important. So they had a choice, and they made their choice. They voted with their feet and with their lives to build their new lives here in Ukraine, and I think that should be recognized by the government, and it is by the Ministry of Temporary Occupied Territories. I mean, they sought jobs in new homes and safety. I think when you ask the question, what do IDPs need? Actually, it's pretty straightforward. Every piece of research that's been conducted by the UN and other agencies has made it very clear. IDPs want housing, and they want jobs. They want a secure place to live. And if they don't have housing and they don't have jobs, then they become isolated from the community and in some ways isolated from from Ukraine and its movement forward, and we need to prevent that. But let me just say, why has that happened? Well, what are the figures like? Well, according to the UN figures, there are 1 in 4 IDPs 3 years into the conflict are still in unacceptable living conditions. And even 6,000 still remain in collective accommodation. So that's how difficult it is. How can you integrate into a community when you don't have a home? It's not possible. So these basic fundamentals that we all need and feel are essentials. The second aspect, I think, is employment. It remains a deep concern for each citizen. House and then shelter and then employment. And you can understand why employment is a problem. If you look at Lugansk and Donetsk, government-controlled territories, from 2013 to 2015, the number of businesses operating in Lugansk fell by 70%. The number of businesses operating in Donetsk fell by 60%. That's led to high unemployment figures. In Lugansk and Donetsk, government-controlled territories, I think Lugansk is 18.3% level of unemployment, and in Donetsk, 15.6%. And these figures increased last year. They didn't reduce, they increased. And at the same time, the level of poverty in those two government-controlled areas has also risen. Those who actually are living below the subsistence line in Lugansk is actually now 74%. That's an enormous figure of people living in deep poverty. And in Donetsk, the figure is 66%. So what people need is what was described by the ambassador and earlier by other speakers, that you need accommodation, you need a plan to provide accommodation, and you need to provide programs for early recovery and development that allow citizens to develop incomes. Through developing incomes, they can help afford housing. So there's a virtuous circle. If you try and find homes and incomes for citizens, you can change the dynamic of the group. Most citizens who are displaced recognize that we're in a protracted conflict. They know that they're not going back anytime soon. So they understand that this investment is necessary for them if they're going to be able to prosper, and they're committed to it. And I think, citizens who have moved from the conflict areas into government-controlled Ukraine are a huge resource. The country has gone through significant depopulation and continues to do so. This human resource is a vital resource for the nation, for its future economic and social development. They are part of the future solution to a European-orientated Ukraine. They're not a problem. If you begin with a mindset, as I'm afraid some of government ministries do, not the Ministry of Temporarily Occupied Territories, if you begin with the idea they're a problem, then you will not come up with a solution. They are not a problem, they're an asset. They need to be embraced. And if we turn our attention from economic and socioeconomic factors to the peace process, in October there were 1.1 million citizens who crossed with great difficulty, with up to 12 hours, in bad conditions, crossed that contact line. Those people are connecting Ukraine with occupied Donbass. They are a vital part of the future solution to this problem. They will be the drivers of reintegration and recovery when it comes. And importantly, as we enter into elections, they are a vital constituency for peace. There is a deficit in most political parties in Ukraine of championing the idea of peaceful resolution. Yet peaceful resolution is actually important for Ukraine in achieving its economic and social goals. So at some point, this group, or I hope in advance of the new elections, will be a constituency for peace that politicians will need to attract, because I'm convinced that no matter when it happens, they will be given the right to vote. That will be solved. It will happen. It's taking too long, but it will happen. I could say more, but I think my 5 minutes are up at this point. So I think I should make sure that my colleagues also have the opportunity to make their points.
Thank you, Jock. Well, we'll come back to a lot of these points as the discussion goes on. But thank you for raising these very interesting initial comments. Our next speaker is from possibly the largest institution to have relocated from Donetsk to government-controlled Ukraine. Dr. Yuri Temirov is the Dean of the History Department at the Donetsk National University, which is now based in Vinnytsia. who perhaps has a unique perspective on the identity issues that have taken place from the large displacement of people from Donbass and the interaction that they have had now in Vinnytsia and across Ukraine. I think it's worth noting that the recent IDP situation is perhaps the first time in Ukrainian history of large interactions between people from different parts of the country. Ukraine has been for a long time a place where people would typically spend time in their hometown and perhaps visit Kyiv, and very rarely would interact east and west, north and south, and within the different regions. One of the side effects of the current situation is an unprecedented level of interaction. So, Dr. Temirov, if you could tell us a little bit about what it's meant for your students, for your institution, and for the communities where you are now based.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of the event for inviting me to contribute the discussion, but let me continue in Ukrainian. Дякую ще раз за високу оцінку нашого досвіду переміщення.
So we would like to thank you for our effort of relocation of our university, and I would like to speak about identity factor, and I would like to speak about this issue, and maybe something will be more in detail further on. So from the start of aggression of Russia against Ukraine, a lot has changed. And Ms. Irina Bekeshkina, the director of the Democratic Initiative Foundation, named after Ilko Kucher, said that there were developments that are significant developments in identity on the fourth year of conflict, and analyzing the situation. So we have an on-the-ground platform. So speaking about experience of our staff and also the sociological survey on replacement, I would like to say that we should speak not about identity changes. There is change in attitude of IDPs to many basic political issues in Ukraine, and whether to be in Ukraine, and the change in attitude toward joining Russia, the change of attitude towards Russian language. So positive changes happened in the attitudes of IDPs. But now we are speaking about the changes in sentiments and orientations. In order to speak about change of identity, we should speak about the change in basic values. And basic values didn't change, and at least for now. And these transformations in the sentiments and orientations can transform into the change of identity if secured by some social practices. And those social practices, this is the second argument I want to stress on. So social practices depend on individuals, on IDPs, their attitudes, their creativeness, ability to be responsible for his own well-being and the well-being of his family, to increase this well-being. So it depends on the region he went to, and this forms the preconditions of social practices in which these changes in identity can happen. And I would like to draw your attention to such correlation. In one of the research, I found such thing as a minimalism practice. this is really a minimalistic practice, but I would like to be a realist, and I won't expect big changes in the recent future concerning this minimalist practice. And I believe we should put proper focus in the policy concerning IDPs, concerning the change of environment and change in social practices. First, we should identify what vulnerable groups should be supported that now are not able to provide for themselves, and other categories, those who can work, we should create conditions for them. And I fully agree with my colleagues who said that the increase in the level of well-being will change the situation, but it will happen when a person will be able to use the opportunities to increase the well-being, and the state should create proper conditions, but people should be ready to use this situation. And the next aspect, we should identify the target categories. I have already said about those who cannot provide for themselves, we should provide support to them. And those who can, we should create conditions for them. About identities, if we look at the concentration and of IDPs, so if we speak about social practices and building bridges, that are in the report, and that was also stressed by my colleagues, I would like to say about two target audiences. First, the oblasts such as Donetsk, Lugansk, Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, Dnipro Oblast. There we should create conditions that will change the attitudes, and also transfer of professional institutions like our university, like enterprises, institutions. Why I say about university? Because I know about it better, but someone knows better about enterprises and scientific institutions. So these professional institutions, they build cooperation with local communities, and they can influence more in on real changes, to change this attitudes between the community and the IDPs. So in Lviv Oblast, we have 3,000, 4,000, and in the east, the concentration is different, and policy should be different concerning IDPs who have different attitudes, different orientations, and different environment they are in. The third thing I wanted to stress is some ambiguous correlation between IDP's integration strategies for local communities and the strategy of reintegration of Donbas. If you look at statistics, the survey shows that 68% believe that of IDPs believe that they are fully integrated, and 25% said that they are partly integrated. And let's look who are the most successful in integration. These are those who are able to adapt, who are able to efficiently and creatively adapt. Those people that will be lacking in Donbas when this issue of reintegration of Donbas will come in agenda. So these people, they do not plan to return to the places of their residence before conflict. and this is 30 or 40%, those who do not plan to return. And among those who do not plan to return, these are those people without whom successful integration won't be possible. And there are some contradictions. And in analytical report, there is a formula. It is interesting, but potentially it is productive and dangerous. The adaptation that people may adapt and integrate, or they may return. But this can come to contradiction, and here we should have a proper policy of the state and policy of local government and NGO. And the last thing, also our problem of values. This is the result of Soviet model of modernization. This is the result of dominant collectivist and paternalistic values. And this is all Ukrainian problem. This is not a problem of Donbas. This is a concentrated manifestation of this problem, because Donbas is highly industrialized, and these collectivistic and paternalistic values, they are prevailing. And the most efficient method to overcome many problems concerning IDPs and formation of identity and prevalence of all Ukrainian identity over regional identity, there should be proper all Ukrainian transformation, and these transformations should be properly adapted to the IDPs from Donbas, and the social and economic issues are also connected to this. And as a conclusion, I'd like to say that significant changes in identity are important to minimize social and economic consequences of the situation. This should be not just changes of sentiments and orientation, but there should be change of values, and society should be ready to actively participate in this. Government, local government, social activists, we should stress the importance of transformation of values that dominate among the IDPs. Thank you.
Now, we already touched upon the issue of reintegration and the potential role that the IDP community could play in that process. I think it's important point there that as people integrate into government-controlled Ukraine, there will be perhaps less stimulus to reintegrate. I would like to invite our next speaker, Dr. Kateryna Smagliy of the Kennan Institute, to elaborate on this. To what extent do you think there is still a significant desire amongst IDP communities to return to their homes in Donbass, and what role could that potentially play going forward in terms of the longer-term conflict resolution?
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you very much for everyone for being here with us today. And of course, I have to congratulate the Atlantic Council for writing and submitting such an excellent report, which once again advocates for the rights of those who have found themselves in a very difficult social and cultural situation. I'm here today because over the last year, our office in Kyiv has been very actively involved in supporting displaced universities. And again, with support of the US Embassy in Ukraine and the US aid, its program, Ukraine Capacity Building Initiative, we have organized 4 democracy and leadership schools for students of displaced universities. And as of today, we have 120 graduates of those schools, which we believe will eventually go to the areas that they left, and that they will become those civic activists and leaders for the regions who will help to rebuild and to reintegrate Donbass. That's how we actually met with Mr. Yuri Temirov during the visit to the to the Donetsk State University in Vinnytsia, and the spirit that we saw there, the spirit that we saw in Lugansk, in Severodonetsk, and other displaced universities. I personally visited 10 of them and conducted lectures in them, and in total we have made 30 visits to displaced universities over the last year. It's simply amazing. Melinda, during the first panel, she has provided us with a list of 5 areas where displaced persons can help to support Ukraine's economy, Ukraine's social cohesion, and I can only add the 6th element to that, which is the support of Ukraine's humanitarian policy and cultural policy. What we see nowadays is that the education ministry doesn't have a clear vision of what to do with displaced universities, which I believe is a key, are the key institutions for future integration and involvement of those areas which are currently not under Ukraine's control, As far as I know, there is only one manager at the Education and Science Ministry who is responsible for communicating with those universities. And as you understand, these numbers are simply not enough. You know, you need the department which would develop a strategy of what to do with these universities, how to support their material and academic base, because you clearly understand that the people who moved, they had very strong civic motivation to join Ukraine and to be supportive of Ukraine. But this motivation, it's by itself, is not enough. You need material support, you need dormitories for your students, you need books for your libraries, and I was shocked to see that at some displaced universities there are literally maybe 100, 150 books. If you have thousands of students and no literature to support the intellectual development, then how can you think potentially of reintegrating those areas which are not under Ukraine's control? So let me say that I, as a believer in science and in progress and in academia, I can only encourage Rinat Akhmetov's foundation to support, not only to provide social, this food, you know, shelter, all of this is very important, but please think 10, 20 years ahead and start investing into these displaced universities, because there, as you rightly said, you have your constituency for peace, you have your constituency for progress. Ukraine's government should redouble and triple its efforts, and to understand that, as Mr. Temirov very rightly said, these universities are the constituencies which will produce the future elite for the region. Typically, after our leadership schools, they end up at the Verkhovna Rada, where we organize meetings between the students and Euromaidan activists who has made a tremendous career and became very important leaders of this country. And my personal friend, Hanna Hopko, who is the chairwoman of the Foreign Relations Committee, serves as this role model. Hanna is very generous with her time. Typically, she spends 1.5 hours talking to the students, and by the end of her meetings, she typically asks a question to the students. So please raise your hands. How many of you will go back to Donbass to rebuild it and to kind of give back everything that you've already learned and acquired in Ukraine? And I'm always very saddened to see that spontaneously only 1 or 2 hands are being raised. And this is fully support with the statistics that Mr. Temirov has just cited. You know, if you have 68% of IDPs who say that they're already fully integrated and they don't want to go back, it means it tells a lot. So the displaced universities, they can not only provide the academic and the educational role. You know, the displaced universities have to become real centers of civic integration, and they all have to have now courses on public administration and basically prepare civil servants that will go back. And you of course understand that Ukraine will need thousands of them, thousands in police, thousands in local administration, thousands in local councils. So again and again, please understand that the displaced universities are constituencies for peace, and they are agents of change in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, the discussion so far has focused exclusively on the issues related to the Donbass. Of course, this is not the only part of Ukraine currently under occupation, or the only area from which we have significant IDP communities. Crimea, in many senses, is a perhaps, if I may say, a more distressing theme in the sense that it's not even generally on the table in terms of diplomatic discussions. It's widely accepted that the occupation is a far more long-term perspective, and the communities that have left Crimea are looking at what essentially represents an exile without any intermediate, medium-term prospects of returning, which raises a different set of issues in terms of their long-term perspective and their sense of identity. So we're joined by Tamila Tasheva, who's the founder of Crimea SOS. Tamila, if you could share a little bit of your insights into the current mindset amongst the Crimean exile communities around Ukraine, how they're addressing the realities of their exile.
Доброго дня всім. Дійсно дуже рада виступати на цій поважній конференції.
Really glad to speak at this conference. All the issues that were raised are really important, and today I'm going to speak not only about the issues of Crimea. Our organization was started on the 27th of November 2014 when the Crimea was occupied. From this moment on, from the start, the people started to go away from Crimea. Part of them returned after referendum. That when they understood what happened, and they tried to get accustomed to Russian occupation and annexation. But a lot of people, they just fled. If we are speaking about official data provided by the Ministry of Social Policy, this is 28,000 people who went out of Crimea. Our organization have data that twice as big, because there were migration flows from Crimea, and these were 55,000 people. If we are speaking about ethnicity, half of them are Crimean Tatars, about 25 people, Crimean Tatars, who went out, and they have needs that differ from other ethnic groups who went out from Crimea, and the state should think how to meet these needs and how to work with ethnic communities in mainland Ukraine, who are mainly concentrated in the west of Ukraine or near the line of confrontation in Khersonsk Oblast. And what I wanted to say concerning, I will go back to the issue of Crimea a little bit later. I agree with the ambassador that until Russian Federation leave Ukraine, this issue of internal displacement and all those challenges we face, we won't overcome these obstacles. And we believe, our organization believes, and many people we work with, but partial solution is working with peaceful population, with internally displaced persons. And when we speak about internally displaced people, I would differentiate people who live in Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast from those who live in the west or in the south or in other parts. So people who live in Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast, and even in Kharkiv or Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, their needs are absolutely different from the needs of those people who live in the center, in the east, or in the west of the country. And in the east, we see a big need in emergency programs, emergency response. Humanitarian help is needed, and legal help and assistance in judiciary. And if we speak about people who live far from the eastern part, so we asked people, and they said we went out of Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast in order to be far away from people. Because we believe that our feelings are that they traded us, and this is a psychological aspect when people do not want to return. And if we speak about international standards, we should provide people with the right to live in the territories they went, and to provide comfortable living in these territories. And also meet their needs when reintegration will start, in order that they were able to return. And if we are speaking about the state should have a clear view what to do with these territories and these people, in order that these displaced people became leaders in the territories that are not controlled in the east and in Crimea. When we see people who went from Crimea in order to get a biometric passport, in order to get birth or death certificates, these people, they face discrimination. And I would like to say about second point, about second argument. So this is the 4th year of displacement, but the state doesn't have clear vision what to do with occupied territories, what to do with displaced people, and what should be the attitude towards them. And I see discriminatory provisions in the legal acts that are adopted. So we should stop this discrimination towards these people, and otherwise they won't send positive signals to the occupied territories. Also, I would like to say about the issues of displacement of those people who live in temporarily occupied territories. We should speak about complex, comprehensive approach to housing, education, and the issue of relocated institutions, because we see some plans that can be adopted. I would like to provide such an example. Together with the Ministry of together with the Ministry of the Occupied Territories, we worked on the plan what can be done in order to simplify the lives of people who live in the territories that are occupied in Crimea or who are IDPs. And still this plan is not adopted at the Cabinet of Ministers, and I know the clear position of the Minister Chernysh, who advocates this issue. He speaks about it constantly, and he discusses this with the diplomatic bodies of other countries, and we should seek a comprehensive approach to resolve these issues. Otherwise, we will face big problems. And this comprehensive approach is connected with the changes inside the country, and the war in the east and annexation of territory and the big number of IDPs. This all reveals all the problems that are in our society. And the problem with the registration was revealed when we have this old-fashioned Russian registration. So people are discriminated. So if I am registered in Crimea, so I cannot get benefits, or if I have registration in Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast, I don't have these rights that people from, for example, Lviv, some western regions have when they go to Kyiv, and they are not registered as such people as we are registered. So about humanitarian organizations who started emergency response to meet the needs of people. We started to work with the United Nations Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and also we start to speak with donors and the attitude to people who get this help and those organizations who work with these donors. And we saw that in 2016, part of donors went away without preparing local organizations, and we have tens of organizations that disappeared from the map of civil society, those that responded and met the needs of IDPs. We face the situation when the majority of donors work in the territories of Donetsk and Lugansk and Kharkiv and Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, and they forget about people who live in other regions. And this is the problem, because thousands of people address us, and I would like to say about some figures. In 2016, we provided 8,000 consultations when people got some legal advice. These are hundreds of legal support in court and 90 communities who asked to help them in their development, and 40 towns where we work. We work in 18 regions, and when we see that there is no transfer from emergency and development programs, we see that people who only now understand what they need, they cannot get this help. That's why we should have a responsible attitude towards people who get this help. We cannot just take away the program and go away. And the same about civil society. This is the main driver of all the reforms. If we speak about local government reform, anti-corruption reform, and all the issues concerning internal displacement. And the issue of Crimea in this segment is still missing. If you look at the territory of Khersonsk Oblast, that is the first place where Crimean community go. We do not see proper support from donor communities, and these people, they are just on their own and should deal with their problems on their own. And we, as civil society and international donor organizations, the diplomatic institution, and the Ukrainian state, we should provide clear signal to those people in occupied territories that we are better than the Russian power and what they do and what their proxies do in the Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast. We are ready to support you, we are ready to develop you, and we should have this positive attitude. Otherwise, we won't be able to change the situation. Thank you.
I would like to touch, if I may now, on the subject of coverage of the IDP situation in the media, in the Ukrainian media and in the international media, and the kind of messaging that we're seeing. I think that in general, the Ukrainian situation is focused, or the attention is focused very much on the immediacy of the conflict. The military aspect, by definition, is the dominant feature, and that's logical and quite reasonable. In a second position, I would put the future potential rebuilding of the Donbass itself, and then somewhere in the third, or maybe even lower down the scale of priorities, we have the IDP situation. But listening to your comments here, I think it's quite clear that this is a very long-term issue, which is arguably, in economic terms, bigger than the actual rebuilding of the Donbass itself, potentially. This requires a communication strategy and a way of getting this across to Ukrainian and international audiences. How do you assess the current approach to this? Perhaps, Kateryna, if we could start with you, if you could offer your insights in how you think the Ukrainian media is communicating IDP situation to Ukrainian audiences, and what more could be done?
Well, I'm not an expert in the media coverage, but as an ordinary
As a viewer
consumer of news, I can say that, of course, we need more success stories. Something that is brilliantly illustrated by the report we've just read, where under each policy recommendation you have a very specific example of an internally displaced person succeeding in the community where he or she has relocated. So we need more of those. But I would also encourage internally displaced persons like Mr. Temirov himself to reach out to Western community. The Atlantic Council's blog, Ukraine Alert, is a wonderful platform to do this because it is very democratic. You can submit your article for publication. You, Peter, know this very well because you're a regular contributor to the Atlantic Council blog. The Kennan Institute has just recently launched its own platform, which is called Focus Ukraine, and we give an opportunity for Ukrainian scholars, analysts, experts, and I'm happy to provide a platform for an internally displaced person to, again, to reach out to the West and to kind of demonstrate the argument that had been made by Ambassador Herbst at the very beginning, that the fact that Ukraine's government has succeeded in providing the very basic, elements of support for IDPs, they do not go to Europe, and that is why Europe doesn't feel so acutely the problem with Ukraine's refugees as it does with refugees from the Middle East. But it doesn't mean that Europe and the United States have to close their eyes and to pretend that the problem doesn't exist. The problem does exist. And as support, which has already been provided by USAID and the US government in support of various humanitarian organizations, demonstrate that this support is effective and it should be, again, increased in the future. Maybe Mr. Temirov will have more ideas on how the media can, either Western or Ukrainian, can help in bringing more attention to this issue internationally.
Well, yeah, Dr. Temirov, there were a number of articles about the relocation of Donetsk National University in 2015-16. I've not seen continued coverage since then. Do you get a lot of interest from the media who are looking to know to cover your story of the relocation and the university's integration in Vinnytsia?
По-перше, я в своєму такому короткому виступі свідомо не казав.
First, I have not talked about our case because in this report of Atlantic Council, our case is represented, but you know that our situation, it does not seem integrated picture. It is like disengaged pieces. For example, some advanced training courses are covered as mass media if they were delivered to IDPs, and 20 persons got training, but it seems like it were 20,000. Or when some IDP robbed someone, then as it covered in mass media, it gives such an image as if all IDPs steal something as concerns so the picture which is built by mass media sources, it is distorted, and in Vinnytsia we try to establish relations with mass media sources and information about different aspects of life of our university, and our activities is represented in mass media locally, both on TV and radio broadcasting channels and in internet. From the start of this academic year, I was 3 times at local radio channels and 4 lectures of our faculty for different reasons. For example, 100th University of Ukrainian Revolution or Holodomor, genocide. They provided speeches, but there are also negative aspects. we should understand that we are serious rivals to local Venice educational institutions who want to make some black PR. But in general, the situation is positive. We have a rather positive image of our university and mass media. This is the contribution of the community. It is their positive attitude to us, and also our university is contributing to the development of Venice community. If you allow me, I would add that indeed the situation with coverage of IDPs has been changing dramatically. If we look at 2014, March or April, most IDPs were demonstrated in mass media as positive persons after hostilities started, and many IDPs fled to controlled territories. And negative attitudes among population members, society members evoked, and in mass media this negative image also is formed. So we should address journalists, we should establish relations with them. We established the training course for journalists. They should provide more well-balanced information in their sources, just seeking that they do not make accent on that it was IDP who robbed someone. They just taught them not to tell that, not to accent on that this person was an IDP. We launched the 12 case studies project. They are stories of successes among IDPs, which provide potential for business environment and communities in their new places. Then after that, after our activities, we saw that Ukrainian mass media started talking more about stories of success and about people who established some organizations or social businesses, and information about IDPs, positive information became more covered. Now we see more interest to IDPs when some negative things happened on the side of government, some inspections against IDPs. They are covered in mass media. Our mass media sources work only by information requests. For example, they need some situation to cover. For example, arrest, the wave of arrest was in the Crimea, and after that mass media coverage would be very intensive. The same concerns IDPs. When something happens, then after that the issue is covered. What is happening with the Western mass media? Now we see that there are little publications about IDPs in Western mass media. Although the interest was huge at the beginning. Journalists from foreign mass media, they really visit Ukraine, they collect data around Ukraine, visiting many places, and then speak on radio broadcast, but this is not a permanent interest to Ukraine.
The international arena, the the danger or the risk of success stories, of course, is always the implication that everything's okay and that nothing needs to be done. How do you think Ukraine can strike the balance of a constructive approach to the IDP issue whilst also maintaining the high profile as the diplomatic discussions around Ukraine continue, to make sure that the international community is well aware that this is a very, very major issue for the country?
I think in addition to what the other panelists have noted, is it's important that as the government develop and approve its IDP strategy, that part of that strategy include a public outreach campaign, whether it is to international stakeholders or civil society activists or the IDP community or the Ukrainian public itself. I think it's important that, these are different audiences with perhaps different levels of knowledge, different, they're coming from different places, and they may be interested in slightly different things. And I think one key thing, and then I'll get to the answer to your question, I think one really important key message for Ukrainians internally is that IDPs are people just like them. We've got, at least two on this stage. I am the daughter of two IDPs from after World War II. So this can happen to anybody in any place, and we all rely on each other to survive and to survive these terrible things that happen, and then really thrive afterwards. And I think we've heard a lot about that. But I think it's important for those who may not come into contact with IDPs, who may wonder why why funds are going to a particular part of the population and perhaps not to them when they have their own needs. These are all Ukrainian people. They are all a part of the future, as we've heard over and over, and are contributing in their own ways. And I think it's important to make sure that as Ukraine moves towards its own European future, that everybody move with it, because that's clearly very vital. So in terms of I think messaging to the West, if that is the question, honestly it's a challenge, because there are so many crises out there in the world. I mean, there's North Korea, there's Syria, there's not to make light of a very deadly, serious issue, but I've lost track of how many famines there are in the world. And so when we think about the funding that goes to Ukraine's IDPs, and Ukraine, I think, is 8th or 9th in the world in terms of the most IDPs, and but the countries ahead of it are countries like Yemen and Syria, et cetera, places that are really basically ungoverned, and it's a real challenge, I think, to put Ukraine on the map in an important way, to relate that a balanced story of the many successes that have happened here, including with regard to IDPs, where basic needs are more or less being met, but I think the really remarkable and very inspirational story is how Ukrainians throughout Ukraine have opened up their hearts and their homes to the IDP community, and how the IDP community has given back. But that doesn't mean there isn't still a great deal of need that we and a need for resources that we need to maintain. So I'm not really answering your question because I think it's a challenge.
It's an answer in itself.
Yeah, but I think part of what it is there needs to be a bit of a strategy for how to keep the issue on the plate. And I think part of that is the international community itself, whether it's NGOs, whether it's countries, whether it's international organizations, that they continue to raise these issues, and that the Ukrainian government continue to demonstrate what it is doing itself.
Thank you very much. Now, before we finish our panel, I would like to invite some questions from the hall. Please, the lady in the grey cardigan.
Thank you. I'm a doctor. Я буду говорить по-русски. I come from Lugansk. Я бы хотела, чтобы все присутствующие здесь поняли.
I'm from Lugansk. I would like for everyone to understand that we are not just IDPs, we are not abstract people. We are people, first of all, and we are patriots of our country. And we are here because we support European integration. That is why we moved to the controlled territory. I thought I would not cry, but for 3.5 years I feel, and I'm very grateful to everyone present here, because when you support us, even provide us moral support, I'm very glad to you. You even do not understand how much you do with this moral support to us. I am a doctor, and I advocated my patients previously. Now I am forced to become an advocate for myself, and it is very hard for me to transform this way, to convert. We try to unite in our ADPS community. Our relatives, our friends help us, but we hear from the TV set that there are only donors who help us, but we do not feel any donor support. I represent here the NGO active civil position. I really have this active civil positions in civil society. We should move from words, from speeches to deeds and acts. If you know that we are patriots, this would help all of us to make joint efforts to make big step forward. Please give us the opportunity to tell you and other people about our problems and about our success stories. And as mass media say, we are invested much money into, but we do not feel any money from donors as IDPs. Maybe some audit, financial audit should be launched.
Input, yes, certainly. Okay, if I can invite one more question, please, from the gentleman at the back. Can we pass the microphone across, please?
Дякую. Михайло Доценко, американський.
Thank you, Mikhailo Datsenko, US-Ukrainian Business Council. I have a question to Ms. Tasheva and Mr. Temirov. Our organization and several American firms working in Ukrainian IT and communication technologies are a part of Digital Agenda for Ukraine group. Computerization, digitalization, could it help, and to what extent it could streamline the process of registration, so that registration do not prevent IDPs from getting their entitlements, such as pensions or benefits or welfare? With medical reform, there will be the register of patients and doctors. This will be of impact because of medical reform. As concerns the Donetsk National University,
In your international experience, has digital registers of any kind, or a tick or a checkbox for an IDP in a setting in a different country? Has it helped in any other country when it comes to the type of problems we're talking about? It's getting the pensions, it's to prove gazillion times with 10,000 different paper documents that you are registered here, but you actually live there, and so on and so forth. In your experience, has there been any in that? And if yes, then how can this ICT community in Ukraine help? Thank you. Дякую.
Я можу почати. Звичайно, що спростить.
Yes, of course, it will simplify. The first example is that if you are a pensioner from Crimea, to get your pension, you will need half a year just to be provided this pension, because Ukrainian authorities demand that the pensioner bring paper form. So Ukrainian pension fund send requests to Moscow, then Moscow send requests to Crimea, and then this paper form is brought by email or by C-mail to Kyiv. As usual, this is half a year time period. The second, all of us see visa liberalization and no borders for Ukrainians, but this does not concern people who are registered in the east of Ukraine or Crimea, because these people are subject to additional verification, and the person from Crimea or east of Ukraine can't get biometric passports within the period set for all citizens of Ukraine. So if this information is digitalized, as you say, of course these requests when verification of a person is conducted could be carried out far faster, but we need to go to digitalization, as you said, of the whole document management in the country.
I don't actually have experience with regard to either paper or digital kind of registration of IDPs, but I can't see how it wouldn't hurt. I think, without wanting to call anybody out from the stage, I think there are some experts here, and perhaps I could introduce you afterwards.
Thank you very much. That's all we have time for this panel, so I'd like to thank all of our panelists for their valuable input, and also for their efforts to raise the awareness and support for the IDP communities in Ukraine. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
We're not quite done yet. You can have 1 minute to get up and stretch, but we are really, really honored to have two representatives from some of the leading humanitarian organizations here in Kyiv to give concluding remarks. So I'm going to let our panelists find their seats. And I'm going to give you 1 minute to stretch, but we're going to have very short concluding remarks from the head of the International Committee of the Red Cross in Ukraine, as well as the representative of the Office of the United Nations, the High Commissioner for Refugees. So please just take your seats and give us a minute. You can have 30 more seconds to stretch.